So today we're going to be talking about Jesus and responsibility. So we always like to start out by defining what responsibility is. So it's important for us to know what our own perspectives, our own understanding to get a baseline. So what does responsibility mean to you guys? Anyone? Any brave soul?
Duty.
Duty, okay. Oh. Anybody else? Responsibility?
Commitment.
Commitment, okay. Anybody else? Responsibility? There's a mic for you.
Our mission.
Our mission, okay.
Ability to respond.
Ability to respond. Anyone else? And okay, all right. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. Thank you, Paula. I'm actually going to leave this here in case we need to use it later. So responsibility, we're going to go over the definition from a Spiritist perspective and more specifically from Joanna's perspective and obviously from the layman's terms perspective. But today's talk is going to be really about self-reflection, as most of our talks are. And it's really important that when we talk about responsibility, that we're not referring to the responsibility of somebody else, which we will get into a little bit tonight. But it's important for us to constantly be reflecting on ourselves and not thinking about your neighbor, your spouse, your partner, or just somebody else. That we're doing that, our own internal work that we need to do. A friend of mine recommended this book, and I wanted to recommend it back to others because it's a really good book. Paul, I have a feeling you might know this book, maybe not. It's called You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, Bringing Courageous Love to Intimate Relationships by Richard C. Schwartz. It's a book based on internal family systems, and I won't get into that, but it's a very inspirational book about relationships. Why am I bringing this? Because there's a very interesting poem at the beginning of the book, and I wanted to share it with you all. As a starting point for our discussion tonight. And the poem does not have a name. It's just from a book of collected poems by Derek Walcott. Y'all have to pay attention very intently to get what this poem is trying to say. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at each other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you have ignored for another. Again, that's Derek Walcott from his book of collected poems. It's important that we learn to show up for ourselves and that we learn to do that self-reflection and that we learn to meet ourselves for the first time. So when we're going through this study, and today as well as any other Saturday that we're doing this study, it's important, again, for us to do that self-reflection work. So in layman's terms, what does responsibility mean? Responsibility, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, is the quality or state of being responsible, such as moral, legal, or mental accountability. Some synonyms are reliability, trustworthiness, and also something for which one is responsible. Now, it's really interesting when we talk about responsibility, and when we were studying, this came to our minds, and when we were discussing with someone, this came up. When we talk about responsibility, we're not necessarily talking about the responsibility we have at work, although that's important because we have a responsibility, but more so our responsibility before life, before everything. And when we are going through life and making an analysis. Not that everyone does that, like from day to day, moment to moment. I'm sure we're all not analyzing every single last part of our lives, although it would be a good habit to start to do. But we're talking about our own responsibilities to ourself and how important that is. And we were having a discussion with a friend who said, well, what about the responsibility of somebody else? Well, who's going to be in charge of that? They are, not us. It's not our responsibility to keep tabs on somebody else, with very few minuscule exceptions. So I just wanted to go over a few talking points real quick about fault, responsibility, and our community. We are each responsible for what we do, how we act to a situation. We don't always have the opportunity to control our circumstances, where we're born into, who we're born to, and the circumstances that we're perhaps born into as well, the country that we're born into. We don't always have the option, though, from a Spiritist perspective. You may have had a hand in putting that plot together for you. But ultimately, when you're born into it, there's not a whole lot you can do to change it necessarily. But the only thing we do have control over is ourselves and how we react to it. The one, we would say, kind of exception in a sense, because I know this is going to come up in somebody's mind, came up in ours. If someone has physically abused you or is currently physically abusing you in any way, we have a responsibility to report this person to the appropriate authorities so as to prevent them from harming others in our community or in the world. We share this because our talk today from Joanna de Angelis heavily reminds us to reflect back on our own personal responsibility and not what someone else is supposed to do, unless that other person is infringing on the rights of another person, i.e. if they're abusing someone or abusing a child, so forth and so on. We have that responsibility to report it. Does that make sense? It's logical, right? It's common sense. My daughter would say common sense is like deodorant. Everyone should use it, but not everyone does. So it's, something for us that's worthy of noting. And also people who suffer trauma may be young when it happens to them, and the adults around them are responsible for protecting them. I'm saying this because I don't want anyone to be listening to this talk, watching this talk in the future, currently, and thinking, well, I went through something when I was young and I didn't know, and so I didn't tell anyone. So I don't want to cause a inner conflict in anybody to feel guilty for not doing something that has already passed, that you didn't know what to do. Because when we're young and inexperienced, we don't know until you know. So just that caveat. And there's a quote by Stephen Covey, that is the author of the book, The 7 Healthy Habits of Highly Effective People. And he says, the key is taking responsibility and initiative, deciding what your life is about, and prioritizing your life around the most important things. That's a really good reminder, sort of a mantra to reevaluating ourselves daily. How are we prioritizing our lives? So to begin our talk, before we go on any further, we wanted to bring this video clip. And please forgive me because the language is, there's no profanity, but there is a little bit of strong language, I would say. Like he uses the word damn, which is kind of strong. So I just wanted to let you know that I do apologize, but I did feel that the message outweighed that small little hiccup. So Leo, please, the lights.
A friend of mine, having a debate with a friend of mine, and we got stuck on the difference between fault and responsibility. She kept talking about how something was somebody's fault. It's somebody's fault. And I was like, it don't matter whose fault it is that something is broken if it's your responsibility to fix it. For example, it's not somebody's fault if their father was an abusive alcoholic, but it's for damn sure their responsibility to figure out how to deal with stress and try to make a life out of it. It's not your fault if your partner cheated and ruined your marriage, but it is for damn sure your responsibility to figure out how to take that pain and how to overcome that and build a happy life for yourself. Fault and responsibility do not go together. It sucks, but they don't. When something is somebody's fault, We want them to suffer. We want them punished. We want them to pay. And we want it to be their responsibility to fix it. But that's not how it works. In your heart, your life, your happiness is your responsibility and your responsibility alone. As long as we're pointing the finger and stuck in whose fault something is, we're jammed and trapped into victim mode. When you're in victim mode, you are stuck in suffering. The road to power is in taking responsibility. Your heart, your life, your happiness, your responsibility, and your responsibility alone. Hey.
So Strong Words by a well-known actor, musician, and I'm sure he does other things as well. Yeah, Will Smith. No, I know, I was going to say his name. I was trying to premise his name by stating who he is. So that was just a little tidbit as a foreshadowing for our talk today, because if you read this particular chapter in depth and you study it and you go over it again and again and again, it brings us to this idea that ultimately we are only responsible for ourselves and the lives that we affect, yes, around us. But we have to make the choice in our lives to react one way or another. We have that choice. So as we think about that, let's reflect on Joanna's words in regards to responsibility and her definition. She says, and for those who are following along with the book, I have not followed the exact sequence, thank you, that she has it, so you might not find it. She says, responsibility is the result of a discerning conscience that grasps the reason, purpose, and aim of one's life, working to assume the role for which one is destined. Responsibility drives people to the extremes of sacrifice, self-denial, and the renunciation of their well-being, even their lives. So she gives us this picture of what it looks like, or what it's supposed to look like. And so she does bring up Jesus, obviously, in this chapter. Clearly, we're talking about Jesus and responsibility. But Jesus was a perfect example of this extreme of sacrifice, self-denial, the renunciation of their well-being, and even their lives. And I just want to say one thing, because this might come up. Well-being, the renunciation of their well-being. This does not mean that Jesus or the other people I'm about to share gave up self-love, self-nurturing. No. It means that he gave up because he didn't have to come to earth and go through all the suffering that he did. He gave that up momentarily for a period of time to come and help us. Much like Martin Luther, although not perfect. Because of what he sacrificed, I don't know to what extent. But we learned after watching it that she actually was a pretty amazing soul. She actually would get messages from God per her, and they were premonitions. She get these premonitions of what was going to happen, so she was able to save a lot of slaves. So if you have the opportunity to watch this movie, and you don't feel like you're overly sensitive to such harsh things in history that have happened, and her life, her story is pretty amazing. She was an amazing soul. I kind of view her now as the Joan of Arc of the African American world, in a sense, because Joan of Arc, the spirits talked to her when it came to helping France. So, and she's glorified, and Harriet Tubman is glorified to a point, but not as much as Joan of Arc. Joanna goes on to define responsibility in the following way, and she personifies it, puts it into a practical sense where we can actually think about ourselves and the actions we take. She says responsible people are neither neglectful nor hurried. So they take their time, they don't neglect the things that they need to do, they take care of what they need to take care of, and they're not in a rush. Goal of achieving wholeness. it's a good question to ask ourselves, what are our own personal goals? What am I striving towards? What am I working towards? And a really good, important question that I hear, because I watch a lot of Dr. Phil, and he says a lot of the time to the people his guests who have certain behaviors that are toxic or just they're not really working out and are yielding bad results, he always says to them, well, how was that working for you? So it's important for us to evaluate what we're working towards and if what we're doing is really working for us, or if we are in our own way, which we will be talking about today as well. She says, responsible people implement a serene action plan within the parameters that characterize individual and collective progress. What does that mean? In layman's terms, this basically means when we are setting our goals and our action plan, that we are not only choosing things that benefits us, but ultimately can benefit those around us, those in our city, those in our neighborhood, those in the world. So if I want to be a social worker or someone that helps other people, those are my goals. So I'm benefiting all those whom I'm coming in encounter with, right? Makes sense. It's logical. She says also they don't become social parasites. They don't rely on people for their living. Now, so you might say, well, what about people who are on assistance, medical assistance, things of that nature? Every intention, and far be it from us to judge anyone. We're not here to, use the gavel and pass this to anybody else's life but our own. Because only God truly knows the heart of other people. We don't know what goes on in the hearts of other people. Again, this is just for us to do our own self-reflection. She says, responsible people, they don't ride on other people's success. They create their own success. Success is not making $1 million a year, necessarily. It's not having the biggest house on the block or the best car. That's not necessarily success. Success is finding that inner peace, achieving your own personal goals, and things that are something that no one can ever steal from you. And she said, responsible people, they don't hide behind silly excuses. Well, I can't do this, or I can't achieve this because of X, Y, and Z. Or because I was raised like this, I can't do that. I don't have the money for that. I can't go there. I can't become that. I can't play the guitar. Well, if you can't sing, I'm sorry. It's one thing. But you could take singing lessons and sing a little bit better. But everything is effort. And I heard this story recently from Joel Osteen. Do we all know who Joel Osteen is? Yes, okay, great. So his story, we all probably know more or less his story, that his father was a pastor, he passed away, then he became the pastor of his church and grew this big conglomerate. But one story I didn't know about that he was sharing recently, he said that when him and his wife, Victoria, first got married, they were like any other regular average people. They were starting out. They didn't have money. They were like, just average Americans. So they were saving for their goal was to save for a lot of years to put a down payment on their home, on their first home. So after some time, they were putting money away. They were saving money. They were scraping because there was just the two of them at that time. They didn't have the kids yet. So they were able to put away a significant amount of money. And then one day, Joel said he got a letter in the mail from the IRS saying that he owed thousands and thousands of dollars to the government. And he was shocked. And what he found out, what happened is the person who did, the CPA that did his taxes actually lived in a different state and was not familiar, they afterwards found out, with the laws in Texas, the tax laws in Texas. So that in turn cost them thousands of thousands, and all of the money that they had saved at that point for several years needed to go to paying off this taxes. And they were completely heartbroken. And they were just shattered, you might think, well, why, God, why is this happening? We did our taxes. It wasn't our fault what happened. So Joel thought about it. He prayed about it. He said, okay, I'm going to do something about it. So him and his wife, they searched for a tax attorney, just a local one in the area. And he became acquainted with him. And he said for about 2 weeks, this tax attorney used to come to his house, his apartment house, every day, eat dinner with him, stay for hours, going through new paperwork and doing a bunch of other legal stuff that, the attorney had to be present with Joel in order to get certain questions answered. So they did this, and they actually formed a relationship. So they kept this relationship even after the fact. And eventually, actually, this attorney helped him to not have to pay back all of the fee in its entirety. So it worked out well. They stayed friends. Many, 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 many years passed, and Joel, his congregation was growing, and someone had offered him to buy a radio station or a television station, one of the two. And he said, I didn't know anything about contracts or laws or anything. He's like, I knew about God in seminary. Asked me what you want, I'd know, but I didn't know about that. And he said at that moment, it had been years, like decades, since I had thought about my attorney friend. So he said, I called up my attorney friend, and he said, oh, sure, I'll help you with your contract. So with his help, they were able to secure a really good contract, and were able to get this particular television station or what have you. And years had passed when they had this particular television station or whatnot, and it was because of that television station that when they sold it, let me backtrack a little bit. If you all have seen Joel Osteen in his current church, and it's like humongous. So when they found that place, it was going to cost about $100 million just to renovate. And Joel said to his wife, there's no way. We don't have this kind of money. He had money, but he didn't have $100 million just to go throw it into a building. So they had decided at that time that they didn't really have a need for the radio station or television station, whatever it was, anymore. So they decided they were going to sell it. So with the help of the attorney who'd originally gotten them this amazing contract, they sold that station for millions. He did not say it was an undisclosed amount, but he said millions. It was enough to cover the renovation and more of that place. So why am I sharing this story? As Joel likes to say, many things in our lives seem like a setback when really it's a setup. So he said, it might have looked like, and even to us here, that tax issue 15 years ago was huge. Was going to use all of him and his wife's savings. And he was questioning God, why is this happening? This is a huge setback for us in our goals and our dreams, and we're living right and righteously. But he said, in actuality, that was God's set up, because had it not been for that attorney who helped us fix that situation, if that situation had never happened, we would have never met that attorney. And that attorney played a huge role in getting us the contract to that radio station, which we sold for millions, which allowed us to get the church that he's in now. So everything works for our benefit. When we're thinking about our lives, our struggles, everything in our lives is for our own benefit. That's why it's important for us to do this self-evaluation of what we're working towards. And not only that, but evaluating how we are reacting to the things in our lives. How am I behaving? How am I reacting or acting when something bad goes wrong in my life? When things don't go my way? The only responsibility that exists in the world is our own personal responsibility that we have to choose how we're going to deal with a situation. Because oftentimes we cannot change our circumstances. We can change how we view them. As usual, Joanna brings Christ into the mix, because we use him because he is our model and our guide. He is the backbone of this talk and of our studies. And she brings in our reminders of Jesus. And she says, As the shepherd of souls, Jesus has taken responsibility for us, enlightening us regarding our duties, true needs, and real objectives. He gave himself for us, even in death, as if his life by itself were not a great and stoic enough sacrifice of love. He called all those who sought him to the duty of responsibility, which renders them capable of great achievements. So Jesus didn't just come to leave us this great example. When people came to him to get healed, when people came to him for help in their situations, and he did help them, who remembers what Jesus often said to those whom he healed after he healed them? Go and sin no more. This is what, and we'll kind of go a little further into what Joanna says. This is what Joanna's beginning to reference. The great achievements. Go and sin no more. We don't have to go back down the same pathway. We can achieve such great things. Let's go on and we'll discuss more. She says, knowing the human soul in its full reality, he identified it as the source of all ills as well as all blessings. Knowing the human soul in its full reality, he identified it as the source of all ills as well as all blessings. So we can be our greatest obstacle, but we can be our greatest team player. And I hear often from different sources how important it is to be your own best friend. So if you're complaining about something or you're going through something, you have to imagine talking to your best friend and what advice would you give them? And give that to yourself. Because 9 times out of 10, we're a whole lot more compassionate, more understanding, and more clear-headed when we're giving advice to somebody else. But when it comes to us, sometimes we can falter. That's why sometimes people say, man, I wish I could take my own advice. So we have within us the capability. She goes on to say, because people actually cling to their woes for the pleasure they bring, they become inured, which means accustomed to something especially unpleasant, to their misfortune, in which they remain somewhat comfortable, despite their display of discomfort and unhappiness. And we see this across the board. If you see people in bad, toxic relationships, they tend to stay for a variety of different reasons, but there actually is research that shows that people who go back to abusive relationships time and time again, in part because it's a comfort for them. They know it. That's what they know. It's not so much that they like the abuse, but it's a familiarity. As Joanna reminds us, we become accustomed to it. And it's sort of like that story of the dog who's crying on the side of the gas station, and someone comes by and says, why is that dog crying? And the owner says, oh, he's laying on a nail. And the guy says, why doesn't he just get up? He's like, well, because it doesn't hurt enough. So that's a lot of our story, that, well, it hurts and we're complaining, but really not enough to do something about it. So in talking to one of my patients recently, who has many of my patients I deal with have addiction issues. So she was opening up to me and talking to me and saying, I know I have this issue. I know that I have these group of friends, because she's currently clean, but she's like, I know I have this group of friends and I know they're a bad influence, and I know that I have a high probability that if I stay with them, I might fall back, and I know it. So I listened to her. I held space for her, allowed her to talk and vent and get things out. And I said to her, well, so you know consciously the decision that you're making. She said, yes. And you know what it could lead to. And you know that it's a painful situation for you because that constant reminder of the life you used to live, you don't want to live anymore. Yet some part of you is so comfortable with them because you've known them for years. They're the same ones that have been using with you for years, but you're clean. She said, yes. As long as you are making an educational decision and you were aware. In a way, that seems crazy. But actually, the fact that she was even self-aware enough to recognize that that was a conscious decision she was making is a step in the right direction. Because many people don't even get to that level of seeing the toxic cycle of relationships and friendships that they're in and the company they keep. Joanna goes on to say, consequently, aware as he was of the causes of their troubles, whenever Jesus received those who came to him, he strongly urged them not to return to their erroneous ways so that something even worse would not befall them. And that's when we were referencing earlier, when Jesus would heal people, he would say, go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. He said that because he knew our tendencies to go back, for those of you who can't see this in the back, to go back to our erroneous ways, our old habits, basically, in layman's terms. Old habits die hard. That old part of ourself that wants to yank us back into old habits. Instead, we need to tell that part to set aside, to sit on the sideline and say, and embrace and lean into change, self-betterment. Joanna goes on to talk more about responsibility. She says, responsibility frees people from themselves, lifting them to the higher planes of life. Responsibility frees people from themselves, lifting them to the higher planes of life. How does responsibility free people? What do you guys think? How's that possible? If I'm tending to my responsibilities, how is that freeing? Yes, go.
Well, I think we don't waste any more time in try to create excuses, look back, things that cannot be changed. So we have more time for more productive actions. That means responsibility. So we don't go in circle, wasting our energy, our time.
Yep.
That's, I think.
Yep, exactly. Thank you for sharing that. You get an A+ on the test. We need to get out of our own way. Stop being our own worst enemy. She says, as long as they insist on cultivating primitive passions, they misadjust their emotional structure, becoming their own victims and falling prey to degenerative and caustic illnesses. So responsibility frees us from these primitive passions, because once we choose to be responsible before the laws of God, before our life, and set goals and saying that this is what I'm going to be, I'm going to show up for myself, I'm going to take responsibility for my life and take ownership and control and hold myself accountable, which is a synonym for responsibility. Hold myself accountable for how I choose to react to the things that happen to me in my life. She goes on to remind us, moral renewal provides an effective channel for wholesome energies, preserving individuals for the higher purposes for which they are destined. We already know, in layman's terms, what is she saying here? Moral renewal provides an effective channel for wholesome energies. Anything that is good, and I think that's the name of the book, It Is Good to Be Good by Gary Schwartz. We know that there's research out there that when we do good things, is it Gary Schwartz? Stephen Post, thank you. Stephen Post, sorry, Gary. It is good to be good. So there's research out there that says when we, do good things happen back to us in return, and we have positive reactions in our body, in our whole system, and the ways in which our body reacts, the hormones that are released from our brain, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that it is good for us to live a morally upright life. We know this already. Science already tells us this. Joanna's just reminding us of that. Yeah. She says, humankind has survived thanks to its responsible individuals who work continuously for the good, the beautiful, and the ideal. These are the pioneers, the Christs of the world, the Harriet Tubmans of the world, the Mother Teresas of the world, the Martin Luther Kings of the world, and so many others who honestly are not recognized in history, who do so much good that we don't even know about. But we have to be grateful to them because they're the ones who've established so much of our progress for us. The pioneers in psychology and modern medicine, all those who went before us and who were brave enough to say, no, I think it's this way. We need to veer off in this way. When Carl Gustav Jung, when he kind of branched off from Freud, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paula, that was a huge thing. I mean, Freud was the guy. So for him to kind of go his own way was huge. He was a pioneer and helped shift to some degree psychology as we understand it. So there have been pioneers that have come already before us. And she says they stand out for the greatness of their accomplishments cemented in personal sacrifice. So we can tell a tree by its fruits, in layman's terms. She goes back to talking about Christ and reminds us, after he healed lepers, obsessed individuals, and the woman caught in adultery, Jesus' warning to them was always based on responsibility, so that in storing up ethical values and fulfilling spiritual duties, they would not return to their wrongful ways. This is how responsibility is important in our lives, that we grasp the concept. So we don't go back to our wrongful ways, as she puts it, or so that we can reevaluate our lives and do and choose the right pathway for us. Because our circumstances do not define us. What happens to us does not define who we are. How we choose to react to those circumstances can be who we are. Sometimes our initial reaction is not good. It's one of revolt or angst or lack of understanding, but we can change that around. And just some take-home thoughts for us today. From Joanna, she says, right now, as you need him, Jesus, reformulate your notions about life and begin to act correctly, led by responsibility, led by that sense of accountability that we are going to hold ourselves to. And this is so interesting because for those of you who come to our Thursday study sessions, I just started to go back, and we had a interesting comment, and I don't know if this person wants me to call them out, so I won't say their name, but this particular person was talking about how they used to have a bumper sticker on their car, and it had something about Kardec, and this particular person always felt, while they had this bumper sticker on their car, this sense of self-accountability, like, oh my gosh, I have to drive correctly, I have to do my best because people are going to see Kardec and associate me, so I have to be my best behavior, or else I'm. And she said that once the sticker came off the car, it was like a load off of her conscious, because like, ooh, no one's going to know I can hide in my car, I can cut people off maybe. She didn't say cut people off, I'm saying it. And I remember feeling the same way, because sometimes years ago when we would come to the center driving in our car and I would beep at someone because they're going slow or something, I would think, oh my gosh, what if that person's going to the center and I see them and they know me and I'm like, oh gosh, I was just a terrible person. So it's this sense of accountability. We know when we're not doing something that we should be doing. We have that little, angel and devil on our shoulders trying to sway us one way or another. Do not blame others for your setbacks and failures. Identify them and begin your renewal. This is such a powerful sentence. I wish I could tattoo it on the brains and hearts of humanity. Do not blame others for your setbacks and failures. Identify them and begin your renewal. If you study victims of trauma, what differs the successful people, meaning the ones who are able to transcend and be resilient, versus those who chose to stay in victimhood, are those who are able to not blame others for those setbacks. We can look at people like Maya Angelou, for instance, who came from impoverished, somewhat broken home, being put back and forth between her biological mother and her grandmother, and then being raped at the age of 6 and going mute for quite a number of months to years after that. It's traumatic to experience rape at the age of 6. But she did not allow that to define her. Instead, she became the Maya Angelou that we all know and hopefully love and admire. The same goes for people like Oprah Winfrey. We're only stating this because these are the people that have just come popping into our head at this moment. But she too experienced sexual abuse and trauma and didn't allow that to define her. Although there were people in her life telling her, you're trash, you're black, you're never going to amount to anything, you're good for nothing. She said, I could have believed that. I could have said, you know what? I don't come from anything. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do with my life? But she chose to believe in herself instead. And she became what she is today. And I don't know how many of you know this about Dr. Wayne Dyer, the late Dr. Wayne Dyer, because he passed away already. I heard him tell his story of when he was applying to his doctorate program. And that he said, it's either his doctorate or his undergrad, one of the two, but they're equally just as important. He was talking about how, he probably thought he wasn't going to get in. And I believe I want to say he didn't get into the program. For the sake of the conversation, let's say that. But he wrote this long letter to the dean, let's say, of admissions, and explained his whole life and was able to actually, I believe, have a meeting with them and explain his whole life and why he should be eligible to join this program, that he was a dedicated, responsible, goal-oriented young man that wanted to make a difference in this world. And he just needed someone to give him a chance. And this person could have been like, no, on to the next. But that person gave him that chance, and he became who he was today. And those of you who know who Wayne Dyer's story, he was in foster care, and then he went back to his mother, and it was very unsettling childhood. So he had every reason to blame all the setbacks for anything that he failed at. But he chose otherwise. Do not blame others for your setbacks and failures. Identify them and begin your renewal. This is not an easy task. She's not saying it's easy. She's not saying it's simple. She's not saying that you're going to get it on the first try, that the road's not going to have bumps. She's not saying any of that. Not at all. You're going to be full of bumps, full of hardships, full of challenges. But our first step is to identify it and begin the process of getting back on track. Believing that God loves us. I was watching an interview with Maya Angelou, and I was really taken aback because Oprah had asked her a question about something that was very meaningful to her. And she simply said, what was most meaningful to her in her whole life was that God loves me. And she said one particular day she was reading a text to her mentor over the phone. She read this text in the book, and her mentor, who also was her voice coach at that time, said to her over the phone, read it again. And she said, God loves me. He said, read it again. God loves me. Read it one more time. God loves me. And in the interview, you see tears falling down her face. She said, I can't believe, I'm in amazement at this creator loves me. Poor little old African-American girl came from nothing, who's nobody, loves me and all my flaws and all my good things too. He loves me, this great creator who's all love and all knowing. But how amazing that is to have that perspective, to have that connection to our creator and to be in all of that. We felt that that's something to even look up to. Joanna de Angelis, in one of her other books, she talks about St. Francis of Assisi and how he lived his life. And that he lived life in this sort of magical way that everything around him, he was awestruck. He was in awe of nature, life. He was dazzled by it. She uses words like magical and just amazing because he was so humbled at the small beauties of the world, the animals, nature, small acts of kindness. It left him in awe. She goes on to remind us, even if you do not want it, you are nonetheless always responsible for the consequences of your actions. I think that's pretty cut, clear and dry. Cut and dry, thank you. We don't like the consequences of our actions, but we're still responsible for them. We're not responsible for the actions of others, but we are responsible for how we react to them. She reminds us, you will reap what you sow. Cut and dry. Not easy when we actually have to deal with it. She ends by saying, therefore, assume your commitment to the Master, and you will stay healthy inwardly, uprightly pursuing your duties with responsibilities. Assume your commitment to the Master, and you will stay healthy inwardly, uprightly pursuing your duties with responsibilities. On the way here to the SSB, we were listening to actually Joel Osteen, and it seems like he has this narrative that he shares a lot, that we need to always just trust God, no matter what's going on, no matter what people are telling us, that not to believe the negative, but believe the positive. And to me, when Joanna says this, making the commitment to the Master, meaning Jesus, that we will stay inwardly healthy, why? What is it about staying committed to the Master that can make us healthy, balanced? What is it? What is significant about staying connected to Christ that can keep us balanced and healthy? Anybody?
It is a direct connection to your life force. I mean, we think we need to eat, which we do. Oh, hello. Direct connection to your life force, which is what I consider a connection to God, spiritual energy. It really is a necessary food.
Absolutely. Anybody else? I think you hit the nail on the head there, Paula. Thank you. I'm just going to shut that off. Yeah, absolutely. It's that connection to that higher energy. It's common sense, right? If we think about it, it's logical. We're connected to a higher vibration. You're raising your vibration, and thus our vital centers become more balanced, become more in tune with our spirit mentor. And not just our spirit mentor, because oftentimes we kind of just tune him or her out. Like we just go, and you turn the dial off. So what happens is they end up using the people around us to help us, to speak words of positivity into us. And we should pay attention to the things that happen to us and the positive things that people are saying to us, because that very well could be our mentor trying to speak through that person to encourage us. And sometimes you might find at the most random times when people will speak positivity. It has happened to me personally many times at my job as a nurse. I think it happened the last time that I can recall right now at the top of my head, the most significant one was a particular day. I was particularly stressed and down, but I had to make a bunch of phone calls to patients. And I was calling numerous patients, going over discharge planning and setting up appointments for them and going over their disease process and what to do and yada, yada, yada. Same stuff I do. I get to one of the last calls of the day, one of the last calls of the day, and I get on the line with this woman, and she answers her phone, and she says, "Praise the Lord, this is Mary." Mary wasn't her name. But she says, "Praise the Lord, this is Mary." I was like, I froze. I was like, who answers a phone like that? So I went into my professional mode of saying who I was, explaining where I'm calling from and all the reasons why I'm calling, and we discuss things and go back and forth. And she just says, "Child, God bless you. I don't know you, but I'm sending you a hug and all my love." And I thought, as soon as she said that, I felt like something melted inside my soul, and I was renewed. This lady didn't know me from Adam. She didn't even see me. She just heard my voice on the phone, and I couldn't have been more like just stoic and professional and robotic in a sense. And here she was just being a servant, being committed to her master, to our master, Jesus, and spreading love. And she was able to break down that barrier for me, that sadness, that sad cloud I was keeping that whole day. That even though I tried to pray earlier in the day, nothing worked for me. But this woman's kindness, in an instant, it melted my heart. So let's think about the responsibility that we have to ourselves, to be kind to ourselves first, and how we affect those around us. We can't change what people do, but we can change what we do and how we react. So those are the thoughts that Joanna and I leave you with today. And we have a couple minutes for any questions or comments, feedback, criticism, constructive or not.
Oh, that was very good. The previous slide, yes, when you say, even if you do not want it, you are nonetheless always responsible for the consequence of your actions. I was thinking that no actions continue to be actions. And we have a lot of excuse not to take the responsibility or the actions. So that Jesus, said the parable of the talent. And of course, the one that hid the talent had all the excuse. Well, my other fellow got 10, he could risk. The other one got 5. The other one got 2, he could risk. But I got only 1. How could I? So we tend to do this in a very intelligent way sometimes. It's not a silly excuse when you have there that we use some silly excuse. No, we sometimes are very smart to bring our excuses that everyone around us, the audience, can say, "Oh, she's right." Of course, but only us will know if this is true or not. If this excuse is really acceptable, is true or not. If I really didn't have ways to apply that talent.
Absolutely. Because at some point in our lives, we have to take a risk. We can't be like that person and hide our talent in the ground and use the excuse that, well, I didn't want to gamble. I don't believe nor Yasko, nor myself, nor Spiritism is encouraging gambling. But just at some point in our lives, we have to take a little bit, we need to step out on faith. Go ahead, Paula.
Your comment reminds me of one of my favorite Wayne Dyer books, Excuses Be Gone.
Great book.
It's so simple. And what I hope is that instead of the excuse, we could come up with a true statement, like I'm scared, or I'm too tired, or I'm worried I can't fulfill it. If you can speak that way instead of the excuse quickie, then you have a chance of growing. Thank you for the talk. It was wonderful. Just to share a little bit of my own background on the word responsibility, it always scared me. It could be due to my strong moral upbringing. The Catholic nuns were good with that, scaring you about consequences for misbehavior. So what really helps me now that I've matured is I would add the words "with joy" to the very last sentence. It is a privilege to be on the earth. It is awesome to be able to respond and to complete responsibility. So with joy, I'm better off with that word.
Absolutely. I actually wanted to speak to something you said about instead of making excuses, acknowledging what emotion we're feeling. And that's why I love internal family systems. It is a type of psychotherapy where it talks about the different parts of us. I'm not an expert. I'm just learning about it recently. But basically, I'll give you an example. Before I gave my talk here today, I was worried about some things. And I asked myself, why am I worried? And then myself answered to myself and said, well, because I fear that I'm not capable of achieving X, Y, and Z. So I told myself, because this is a part of you, step to the side and let me walk into my wholeness and my greatness, because I can do good things. And no matter what happens to me, I can endure them. Because sometimes there are parts of us that we need to ask to step to the side, our fears, our insecurities, and say, I want to step out on faith. I believe in myself. You begin to have a more positive narrative. So thank you for sharing that. It's really good. And that book is really good too, Excuses Be Gone. Anyone else? Comments, questions? I do. I have Leo in the back. You can just pass the mic back.
One comment that I have, Kirsten, and thank you for the talk. It's just in this bringing this topic to all of us in the idea of responsibility. I quite often ask, what is my responsibility, especially when it's in relation to liberty, right, or my rights, And then I think that when we go beyond that, you always have to question your responsibility towards your right and the rights of others. It goes back to this, the second paragraph there, do not blame others for your setbacks and failures. And, you touched a little bit on it, and quite often we see people not directly blaming others or, let's say, for lack of better words, not facilitating the life of others because they had their own setbacks and they don't believe that other people can have a more fulfilling life. And they do things sometimes not directly, or they don't think that they're hurting others, but it's happening. And how much I try to think as well of, am I doing that? Or am I, with my setbacks, also hurting others indirectly? Because sometimes we believe that if I had this type of life, also others have. An example of this is parents who believe that, the harsh life that they lived while growing up, their kids also have to go through. Not necessarily, it's a different way of life, different, time altogether. But how much we see, at least I notice quite a bit, on how much people, they do it, and the madness that they create as well, because they have that inside of themselves and they don't free themselves of all these setbacks, all these things. So I think it's a good point for us to analyze and truly facilitate. If I went through a harsh, like Will Smith was saying, a moment of my life, that doesn't mean others have to go through. Quite the opposite. Now I have to be on the alert so others don't go through, right? And facilitate the life of others so they are more fulfilling. They live a better life and they don't have to go through that. Obviously, everyone have their choices. Everyone have their responsibilities. And what they will do will have consequences. but at least for us to be on the watch, not to cause it or not to create a mess on someone else's life just because we suffered. So.
Absolutely. I think what you're referring to is basically when we have issues, we allow that to spill over into our relationships. So I want to give you an example. Just debating if I should give this example. It's rather personal. So I will. So our daughter was getting ready to, or is getting ready to go away to college, and the usual American stuff, applying to a bunch of colleges and filling out FAFSAs and all that, the whole 9 yards. And I was struggling with this idea of her going away and growing up and becoming, 18, all these kind of things that had triggered my own personal issues that I have for decades. I wasn't aware of it at first. I kind of was, but then I just kind of pushed it aside and said, no, well, I'm worried because I don't want her to, bad things to happen to her. So I justified why I was acting the way I was acting and putting guilt on her and making her feel really bad. Of course, no one makes us feel anything, but I definitely influenced her to feel that way. And I remember coming out of a therapy session and coming to realize that these were my issues, that I was negatively impacting my child, who I love to death. It sounds terrible, to death, but I love so much. It was the first person I experienced real love with in my life, that I could understand that I didn't want that for her. So I remember calling her immediately as I'm driving back to work that day. And I texted her, I said, give me a call. And she called me, and she's like, and she came out of class and she's like, what's going on? And I was like, no, I want to tell you something. She's like, okay. I was like, I wanted to apologize. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how I've been reacting. And it wasn't right. I have my own issues that I'm trying to sift through and deal with. And mom's not perfect. I got my own stuff. So I said, it's not you, it's me. So I went on to explain a bunch of things to her, and she just starts crying on the phone. And it was so liberating to her because she no longer had to carry my issues. I took back ownership and was able to free her. And that's how being responsible, living authentically, and living with accountability for myself allowed me to be free and also freeing others. So thank you, Leo, for sharing that.
Yes, comment. So I think in this talk of responsibility, just wanted to bring another line of thought that we have been learning with the Spiritist book and Joanna de Angelis especially. There is a question in the Spiritist book that asks, what's the most effective way for us to improve ourselves? And the answer is short, is know thyself. So this answer, I think, is the root of all our problems, including the lack of responsibility. So one thought that we should, and this is for me first, and I try to put this in practice, is learn with the not responsible act that we have done. The consequence of a lack of responsibility brings to us. For example, I will give an example. It's very silly, this example, but I always think like this. Okay, the gas of my car is close, is 1/4, is close to the empty mode. So I calculate mentally how much miles I have to drive every day. Then I think like, okay, should I stop now to fill up the tank, or should I let this for tomorrow? 95% of the time, if I let for the next day, something happened. Or I'm late for work, or the weather is not good. So I learn with that I don't let get close to E. So that brings some bad experience, and I think we should take ownership of our bad experience and try to be more responsible, starting with the small thing. I'm going to wash this dish tomorrow before I go to work. guess what? You're going to have a night that is not going to be so pleasant, and you're going to miss the dirty dishes over there. Just take extra 5 minutes and do it. So I think that's one example, and I'm sure this with you guys, because a lot of little things I used to postpone, and nowadays I'm kind of speed up. I don't know if it's the age that is, pushing, but I don't want to leave anything for tomorrow if I can do it today. Benjamin Franklin. Thank you.
Don't leave for tomorrow what you can do today. Thank you, Daniel. You said a word that's really important and for us to take home today is the word ownership. And to know and own the parts that we play in the issues that are going on in our lives. Not the circumstances necessarily, because sometimes we don't cause them. Sometimes they are circumstances that we need to go through to learn, but we need to seek out our own ownership, our accountability, the part that we play in our own narrative of our story. We tell in our mind and to others. And I'll end with this story because it's recent, relatively, and I think everyone knows who this guy is. Raise your hand if you know who Howard Stern is. Really? If you know, okay. Howard Stern, you can Google him later, for those of you who don't know. Yes. So he was a radio talk show, mogul, millionaire, yeah. So his repertoire, his narrative, his whole style was very derogatory, was very some might say dirty or low. So for years, that's how he lived. He made his money. His show had a lot of viewers. He's on Sirius Radio, has his own channel, all this kind of stuff. So recently, he came on Anderson Cooper. Was it you, Paula, who told me that? I think it was Paula. He came on Anderson Cooper, and he was sharing how he decided to go into therapy, intense therapy, where he was going several times a week, correct me if I'm wrong, to really take the time to look at himself, to take ownership of the part that he played in the negative narrative he was living that was his life. And his lifestyle, the way in which he conducts his business, has reflected that. Now, has his particular boss and one of the producers, I believe, also changed? Yes, that also impacts him, of course, because she's a more positive person. However, he took the responsibility of knowing he's responsible for himself, because if you've ever seen his movie from decades ago called Private Parts, I know it's not a great movie, but it's just a great sort of look into his mind, that the narrative he told himself and others, that he blamed his life on his family, on his father, on his bad relationships growing up, his child, all these things. Everything was excuses. And my life was bad at this and that and the third. He lived his long life like that until now. I think maybe he's in his, I want to say 60s. He has come to this realization of wanting to change his life, and he's lived it. And now he's living proof. And I love that he went on Anderson Cooper and talked to millions of people across the globe saying, go to therapy, look at yourself, take ownership. You can make heaven out of your hell. Things can get better, and they do. So I'll leave you with that thought from Howard Stern, unbelievably. And we will end for this first part of our meeting. We will go to our second part of our meeting, which is the passes. And let us cue the music, dim the lights.